This is Sarika, and we are going to talk about this project we did called Toxic Instruments. So knitted plastic toys as electronic music controllers. Basically, this talk is going to be split into two parts. So Sarika is going to start and talk about why we chose plastic as a medium for the toys and kind of the implications of plastic being used for something like a children's toy. And then I'm going to talk about a kind of more practical walkthrough of how the system works. So we built an AI system in Super Collider to work with this project, so how that works, why the code runs the way it does, and why it's interesting to use with these knitted toys.
So I wanted to start with this quote from Roland Barthes, which is after he visited a plastics exhibition in the mid-1950s, and he wrote in his book Mythologies, "Plastic is wholly swallowed up in the fact of being used. Ultimately, objects will be invented for the sole pleasure of using them. The hierarchy of substances is abolished. A single one replaces them all. The whole world can be plasticized, and even life itself." This, as I'm sure all of you know, has become increasingly true through the proliferation of plastic. Microplastics, which are created through the progressive fragmentation of larger pieces of plastic, have become ubiquitous in marine environments through the millions of tons of plastic that are in the ocean each year, or that enter the ocean each year. And these bits of plastic become environments for various bacteria and viruses, creating new life even as they poison other forms of life. So as the world has become increasingly plasticized, so too have our understandings of toxicity and futurity, and how we conceptualize our relationship to these things. So the sort of main guiding questions for entering this project were that in the wake of this discovery of microplastics in our own bodies and human blood, and in our oceans, what does an increasingly plastic world tell us about toxicity, and more importantly, what does it mean for the future? And yeah, those questions have really come to guide my thinking around plastics. So the picture here is of the Ivanhoe Reservoir in Los Angeles. In 2007, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power detected high levels of bromate, which is a carcinogen, in the reservoirs used for drinking water. Bromate is made of bromide, which is a naturally occurring substance in groundwater, and chlorine, which we put in water to kill bacteria. And when bromide and chlorine are exposed to sunlight, they react and form this carcinogen bromate. And so the temporary solution to this was to dump millions of these black plastic balls into the reservoir, which would block sun from entering the water, thus preventing bromate from forming. So there's a ton of images like this of this event, and of these thousands of plastic balls floating across the water. And they are super reminiscent, at least to me, of those sort of earthworks and land art that were really prominent in the 1960s and 70s, and of work by artists like Maya Lin, this is the work Wave Field, which is currently on display at Storm King. And when I was thinking about this idea of land art in relationship to plastic, I thought about this idea that both wave field and the plastic balls in the reservoir shift our affective responses to the sort of sensorial input that we are getting from our environments. Here's some more pictures of the reservoir. I mean, it really reminds me of this land art, these thousands of plastic balls being dumped down this concrete embankment into the water. And these sorts of affective responses to our environments evoke questions of how plastics are shaping our understanding of art and of the Anthropocene. And furthermore, this procedure of dumping plastic balls into the reservoir also, to me, materializes this sort of desire that we have for impermeability and for our bodies to be separated entirely from toxicity. So I became really interested in this way of thinking about impermeability and about plastics after reading a piece by Heather Davis titled "Toxic Progeny, the Plastisphere, and Other Queer Futures." Davis writes about bisphenol A, or BPA, which is a plasticizer that's characterized in part by its reproductive toxicity, and it's been used to make plastics, or it's used to make certain kinds of plastics since the 1950s. And BPA and its reproductive toxicity are spaces. Davis characterizes BPA as a space through which queerness and a non-reproductive future might be understood in the wake of toxicity and in the wake of finding things like microplastics in our blood. So Davis posits that reproductive futurism organizes political discourse and the social imaginary as the projected fantasy of continuance. So this is especially true when it comes to environmental discourses. We often see things like protect the children and things like that, where the notion of reproductive futurity is precisely what we are called to protect in these very ubiquitous appeals to protect our children, protect future generations, things like that. But often what these discourses are seeking to protect is not really the health of any future children, but rather this sense of normalcy and a continuation of a sort of normalcy, while a non-reproductive futurity and this sort of embracing of toxicity is viewed as fundamentally abnormal or in opposition to this. So Davis, in the vein of Lee Edelman's No Future, Queer Theory, and The Death Drive, looks towards toxicity rather than away from it as a means of approaching a future. So Davis writes that toxicity is about a kind of future that struggles to be hopeful but is certainly not apocalyptic. Toxicity and the figure of queerness that she puts forth recognize and privilege mutation, sickness, and the permutation of the body by its outside. So this embracing of toxicity is particularly important because, as the plastic balls in the Ivanhoe Reservoir show, this sort of fiction of impermeability is one that has come to define 21st century understandings of art and of the Anthropocene. And additionally, this sort of separation from toxicity is not really one that's accessible to most people. And these lines of access of who gets to separate themselves from toxicity and who gets to sort of be impermeable to the toxins in our environment echo existing power dynamics. So one really striking example of this is Mossville, which is pictured here, and it's a primarily Black community that was infiltrated in 2012 by Sasol, which is still a company hoping to expand their petrochemical plants. So like many petrochemical plants, the petrochemical plant in Mossville leached thousands of pounds of vinyl chloride into the environment, which is an offshoot of PVC production. And it's known to have really adverse health impacts. So the toxins released from the petrochemical plants located in Mossville led to a drastic increase in a wide range of health problems among residents, such as cancer and asthma, so much so that there was a part of Mossville that became known as Cancer Alley. Mossville's population is particularly important here. Their exposure to toxicity was not something that they had any control over, and it was rather a symptom of their disenfranchisement. They're, like I said, a primarily Black community, a primarily low-income community, and they didn't have the sort of political power needed in order to prevent a company like Sasol from coming into their neighborhood in the way that rich and white and affluent communities might. So Davis points out that this drive for impermeability is ultimately an exclusion both of the new life that toxicity has created, the sort of like microbiomes that are existing on microplastics, but also of those already living in toxicity, like the residents of Mossville. Mossville's residents were subject to the slow violence, or what some authors like Zakiya Mon-Jackson call ontologized plasticity, not by their own free will, but because their homes, communities, and lives were understood as being fundamentally disposable. Sorry, let me see on that slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So Davis writes that plastic's inheritance, the wealth, and the supposed safety and sterility that it brings to certain people depends on the disposability of Black, Indigenous, and poor communities. So the disposability of disenfranchised communities, such as the communities in Mossville, can also be understood as this idea of being made fill, which is a term that Marissa Solomon uses in her article Ecologies Elsewhere, Flyness, Fill, and Black Women's Fugitive Matters. So plastic is kind of like the waste infrastructures that Solomon describes in this article. And Solomon talks about these waste infrastructures as making primarily Black communities absent spaces through which Black residents become made into fill, while richer, whiter communities profit. So in the instance of Mossville, richer communities are profiting, like the people who are benefiting from Sasol are profiting off of this petrochemical plant, while the residents of Mossville suffer. This totalizing form of violence through which entire communities become disposable can also be understood in author Christina Sharp's theorizations of anagrammatical anti-Blackness, in which instances such as the poisoning of Mossville are not singular, but are instead anagrams of past forms of anti-Blackness and are signifiers of a world that is instantiated with anti-Blackness. So Christina Sharp writes that she conceptualizes anti-Blackness like the weather, and she says that anti-Blackness is the totality of our environments, the weather is the total climate, and the climate is anti-Black. So plastic becomes transmitted onto people and lands who become dispossessed and disposable so that it can continue to proliferate. Thanks. So in thinking about toxicity and reproductive futurism, I felt compelled to think about this imagery of the toy, which has long been connected to both children and to toxicity. So in Toxic Animacies, Inanimate Affections, Mel Chen begins this discussion of toxicity by thinking about how vulnerability, safety, like immunity, threat, and toxicity all become instantiated in the figure of the toy, particularly in recent panic about like lead content in Chinese manufactured toys exported to the US. So toxicity becomes this vehicle to fuel xenophobic commentary and the like sort of languages of terror that we feel that are like rooted in Orientalist discourse. So Chen thinks about toxicity as this sort of vehicle to fuel xenophobic commentary, and they call it a rhetorical weapon in the rehearsal of US economic sovereignty. So impermeability and this like reproductive futurism function as both a way of maintaining normalcy, but also are used as this guise of change and as these like environmental calls to action. So I became interested in the imagery of a child playing with a toy made out of plastic bags because of the pervasiveness of plastic bags and what that imagery means in the context of toxicity and reproductive futurism, and how this might challenge the image of the child as the continuation of normalcy or as this like fiction of impermeability. So these are some diagrams of how to make plastic yarn or plarn, which is not my invention, but has been a prominent method of upcycling waste in textile and fiber art communities. So there are two main methods of making plarn. The first one is the one right over here, which is like a continuous strand method, and you just continue cutting the plastic bag in a spiral so that you get like a long strand of plastic that you can then tie onto another strand of plastic that you've made in order to get a skein of yarn. And the second method is the one that I've used, where you cut these loops of plastic and then you interloop them with each other to create a small knot. I just find it a little more durable, but you can get you can get a skein of yarn by doing this to your plastic bags. So I created this plastic teddy bear out of plastic bag waste collected from around New York City. So pictured over there is like the knitting in progress, and then here's the finished teddy bear. So I made plarn using the aforementioned looping method, and then I spun the loop strips using my fingers in a drop spindle. And the teddy bear is meant to invite viewers to play with it, engage with it, and kind of really get their hands on it. I think maybe people can relate to this, that I think a lot of us have like these childhood teddy bears that get like really torn up and they get super gross because we've had them forever, and I think that it sort of invites people to like get their hands all over it and touch it and be rough with it. And I think that also forces people to sort of engage with this materiality of plastic, and the fact that like it's a material that will far outlive all of us. I work as a textile and fiber artist, and so I liked this idea of playing with knitted material and playing with the sort of ideas of domesticity and nuclear families that fiber arts like knitting are often tied to. And it also took a really long time to knit, and I think that plays with this idea of time that becomes instantiated in our discourses around plastic, because we have all these plastic bags that we're told that we can just throw away after one use, and it's interesting to me to consider what it means to work with a material like that, and to think about a material like that as like being precious or being something that you really want to like work with and knit with and take a lot of time to use, even though it has this sort of disposable nature to it. And so inside of this knitted plastic teddy bear, there's a contact microphone which picks up vibrations based on contact. So when you play with it, the plastic knit fabric hits the contact microphone, and you can see here that it's like got a little thing sticking out of its arm, so that's connected to a 1/4-inch cable, which is then connected to an audio interface, which was then connected to my computer, and my computer is running a program built by Emma that Emma will explain later on in the talk. So that way my computer can respond to the input of someone playing with the toy to create an original piece of music. So this interactive musical element encourages viewers to play and engage tangibly with the toy rather than remaining passive viewers. So in the article cited here, Ultralife and Decolonial Chemical Relations by Michelle Murphy, Michelle Murphy outlines the unequal ways that we are impacted by chemical violence and how we are inextricably tied to it. So they reject analysis of chemical violences that pathologize disenfranchised communities, or view chemical violence as distinctly separate from lived experience, and instead suggest that we embrace this concept of ultralife, or life already altered. So much like Davis and Chen's criticisms of impermeability, ultralife suggests that many of our lives have already been permeated and altered by toxicity and chemical violence. So Murphy writes, studying ultralife requires bursting open categories of organism, individual, and body to acknowledge a shared entangling and an extensive condition of being with capitalism and its racist colonial manifestations. It asks that we situate life as a kind of varied enmeshment and enfleshment in infrastructure and in each other's lives. So we're constantly entrapped in the lives and conditions of other people and other objects that we're surrounded by. And so this concept of ultralife is a tactic for taking back the epistemologies that have constitutively erased the violence that props them up. And it necessitates this active shift in how we engage with questions of toxicity. So in making the plastic toy, I'm asking viewers to confront their own relationships to chemical violence, both how they're being harmed by chemical violence and how they might be benefiting from other people being harmed by chemical violence. So in the sort of interactive element of the toy, I hope that this encourages viewers to engage actively with a toxic object and to confront this fiction of impermeability. So here I have a quote from Discarding Well, A Theory of Change by Max Liboiron and Josh Leposki, who quote Michelle Murphy and write, "When difference meets power, discarding is about what forms of life are supported to persist, thrive, and alter, and what forms of life are destroyed, injured, and constrained." So I think that this sort of poses the question of what might it mean to embrace the new forms of life living on microplastics, which Davis calls our plasticized microbial progeny. And I think that these forms of interactive engagement with the plastic toy reaffirm the restructuring of social structures that both Michelle Murphy and Heather Davis call for. So both Michelle Murphy and Heather Davis say that rather than relying on categories of the nuclear family and human and non-human, we should burst open these categories of organism, individual, and body, as was in the quote before, to acknowledge the sort of shared entangling with each other. And Davis writes that we should learn from queer social structures or of families not based on biology and lives not necessarily afforded protection from the state or other institution of power. So all of this is to say that in creating the toxic instrument, our hope is that our approaches to a changing world will not be based on this fiction of impermeability, but rather as an unflinching openness to toxicity and the ways in which we are constantly enmeshed in each other's lives.
Cool. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the music generation system works that the toys are connected to. So Sarika mentioned how there's a contact mic and a toy. And so basically any sound that is made when you play with that toy is going to be sent into a computer, which is going to then generate kind of a lengthy piece of music. And so there's kind of 4 goals that I had when I was building the system. The first was, there's a lot of talk about live code, and that's kind of an interesting thing to talk about here, is that Super Collider, you can enter in these rhythmic patterns into Super Collider that will then produce this music. And so since it's very binary in the way it works, as in, a note is either on or off, I thought it would be interesting to have a reinforcement learning system look at that pattern and then extrapolate any important information from it and generate a higher intensity or lower intensity version of that beat that you put in, so that you just have to put in this one live code pattern and then it can kind of create all these other versions of it to create kind of a longer piece, and also so that it can kind of evolve with the player, which is the second goal, was that it would be able to listen to a live performer, whether that be an instrumentalist. So I play sax, and when I was first thinking about this, I was thinking about how it would interact with my saxophone performance, but also with playing with the toy, and kind of evolve and grow or lessen as the performer grows and lessens. We also wanted it to be able to follow a preset score. So say I input 3 different live code beats. Now I want it to be able to listen to my playing or to the toy and move through not only higher intensity versions, but also move through different beat patterns so that it can kind of have this whole score of music. And then finally take part in this joint play that was important to us in this project in order to kind of engage with this toxicity. And also a lot of the system was built to make it seem like the computer was kind of playing and experimenting as a musician would. And I'm originally a jazz performer, so a lot of this has to do with how a jazz combo would communicate with each other. I wanted a computer to kind of be able to do a similar thing. So first I'm going to talk about how it generates these different intensity beats. And so I use this algorithm called Q-learning, which is a reinforcement learning algorithm. And the main 2 concepts that are important to know with Q-learning is that there is an agent and there is an environment. So an agent would be what my computer is doing, and the environment would be what is the beat pattern that I put in. So the agent will act on the environment. So if you have a starting beat of, say, 4 rests, the computer is going to look at that in a kind of binary way. So it's going to look at it as 4 zeros, right? And it gets a little more complicated because we don't just use quarter notes, but this is like kind of a simplistic way. So you have this starting environment of 4 rests. Then the computer system is going to act on that environment in order to make it a more intense version of it. So a possible action would be to invert these zeros to 4 ones, which will make it 4 quarter notes. So we have our starting state, our action, and our ending state. So here we have agent is acting on the environment, and then actually once you do that, you're going to have a new state. So that environment is going to send a new state back to the agent. And you get this cyclical loop of kind of growing and evolving this beat pattern until you have the final result that you want. And then where reinforcement learning comes in, the reason it's called that is because not only do you have this cycle, but you also have what's called a reward. So when the computer or whatever agent it is acts on the environment to make it 4 quarter notes from 4 rests, that is more intense by my system standards. So there's less space, there's more notes, there's more space filled. So that's going to have a positive reward. So here's an example of what this Q table is going to look like. So when you have Q-learning, the reason it's called that is because you have all these mathematical equations, that create this table where you have, okay, you have this starting state, and you have 3 possible actions that you can partake on that state. So say action 1 is inverting the zeros. Now you have a more intense version of the beat. You have 4 quarter notes instead of 4 rests, so you're going to give that a positive 10 reward. Action 2 maybe is to do nothing, is to just leave it as 4 rests. Well, that's clearly not more intense. It's the exact same beat. You're going to have negative 10 reward. And then let's say you have an action where you just change 1 note to a quarter note. Well, that's slightly more intense, but it's clearly not as good as the 4 quarter notes, so you're going to have a slightly lower score. So we kind of wanted it to, again, be taking part in this kind of joint play experience with the person playing with the toy. So it's not deterministic like this. You might have some randomness, which is where kind of the fun comes in. So let's say you randomly invert. There's a 50% chance you invert the beat, and there's a 50% chance that you do nothing. So action 1 during the training phase may have gotten a plus 10 score, but then in actuality, when you run it, well, it doesn't get that same random generation, so now in actuality, it's going to get that negative 10. And that's okay. We want the computer to be able to experiment and make mistakes the same way a musician would, and it also means you're not always going to get the same output every time you do it, because different actions may have different scores depending on what happened in the training phase, and the training phase might not even be exactly what happens when you actually run the system live. So great. So now we're able to generate these different intensities, and it's the same concept for lower intensity but backwards, but the system can work either way. So now we want to be able to listen to this live performer and kind of grow and evolve with them. So basically we'll show a video at the end, and this system is going to output these numbers that are going to kind of tell the user what's going on. So it's going to say total score at the beginning of every period of time. That's just to say that a new period has started. It's just for the viewer's benefit. It doesn't have anything to do with anything going on under the hood. But this first number is going to be what I'm going to call a period score. So basically, the computer is going to look at different time periods that are around 5 seconds each. And it's going to give a score for how intense that period of time was. And the way it's going to do that is it's going to use what I like to think of as like little musical knobs. So we have an amplitude knob, pitch, and prevalence. So basically, here's some very simple pseudocode. If the amplitude of my saxophone or of the toy is above this amplitude threshold, this amplitude knob here, then you get a true for that statement, amplitude larger than amp threshold. And then on top of that, if the pitch is above the pitch threshold, so if, say, I'm playing above 440 hertz and that's my pitch threshold, then the period score is going to go up by 1. But the period score is not going to just be 0 or 1. You can see that it's 13. So what's actually going to happen is Super Collider works as kind of like frames. Not exactly the same as like frames per second, but it runs a bunch of times. Within each time period is going to have more than just 1 frame per second or whatever. So that's where the prevalence score comes in. So if I'm above the amplitude and above the pitch for enough time, then I'm going to get a high enough score. So for 13 of the frames, I have this higher amplitude and higher pitch, then my period score is going to be 13. And so then we can use that to see how intense is the player actually being. So, an example might be if I'm at 70 decibels and 500 hertz, but my prevalence is only 10%, I'm probably not going to get a high enough score. But if I'm 70 decibels and 500 hertz and my prevalence is 80%, there's a much higher likelihood that this period score is going to be higher. So there's a couple more knobs that I now want to add, because we don't want to just look at am I intense for one time period. We want to make sure I'm playing in an intense way for a multitude of time periods in a row. So then we have these other knobs, period and count. So if my period score is above 10, the count score is going to increment. And then if the count is above whatever that knob is, let's say 2, it's actually going to trigger the next section of the piece. So that's how it knows when to go to the higher intensity version of the piece. So an example might look like this. I start with 0, 0. I have low intensity, low count. Nothing's happened yet. This is the beginning of the piece. So in the next 5 seconds, maybe I play a pretty low intensity thing. Like maybe in the toy, I'm just like crinkling it a little bit, but I'm not being very intense, so I get the score of 5. Then in the next period of time, now I'm playing with significantly more intensely. I get this score of 11 because the pitch is high and amplitude is high and frequency is high. So this count is going to increment to 1. And then in the next one, I play even more intensely. I get a 13. The count goes to 2, and it triggers the next section of the piece. So now it knows to go to the higher intensity version of the beat that it has generated. But we want it to be multiple intense periods in a row. We don't want it to just be one. So if I do a high intense period of time, low intense period of time, and switch on and off, that's never going to trigger because we need to hit 2 for it to actually trigger the next section of the piece. So if I'm really intense with 14, that's going to go up, and that's great. but if the next time I'm low intensity, it's actually going to decrement and go back down to 0. So I need to be high intensity for a long amount of time, and then it'll trigger the next section of the piece. And I found that this system worked really well with communicating with the live performer. It felt more like when I was playing in a jazz combo, you know, if you're intense for just like 1 second and then you go straight back to being this low intensity thing, you're probably not going to want the drummer and the bassist to kind of raise an intensity with you. You kind of want to see over time how is it evolving and how is it growing. So that's kind of what I was trying to mimic with this system. So cool. Next step, which is probably the simplest step given how SuperCollider works, is to just be able to follow a kind of preset score. So have these multiple live code beats given in. So let's say I have this score that I'm giving to a computer, and I've given it 2 beats, beat number 1 and beat number 2. So we start with given beat number 1, and it's playing this beat, and I'm playing saxophone or I'm playing with the toy. So let's say I'm playing with the toy, and I'm playing at a very high intensity. It's going to hear that I'm playing at this high intensity, and it's going to be like, okay, I know that they've been playing at a high enough intensity for a long enough time, so I'm going to play now this high intensity version of beat number 1 that I've generated. And then maybe I go back to low intensity. After I've had enough time playing at the high intensity, I'm trying to communicate it, I want to switch. Once it hears that I'm at low intensity, then it says, okay, well I don't have a low intensity version of beat number 1, so I'm going to switch to beat number 2. And now we're kind of in a new section of the piece. So similar to how, you know, in jazz you might have a head and then improv and then another head, it's like, okay, we're moving to the next section, we're doing a new thing now. And so if I'm high intensity after beat 2, then it says, okay, I'm going to play the generated high intensity version of beat 2 that I've created. And then I start playing low intensity, but I've told it to generate a low intensity version of beat number 2. Well, now I can do that too. So now from 2 beats that I've given it, it's created 5 separate kind of pieces of live code patterns that it can play with me, and then if I'm low intensity again, it knows to end the song. So in this way, it feels very collaborative, and it feels like you're really playing with another musician in a way that I've found that just these deterministic systems feel a little less collaborative and a little less mutable. So yeah, and that way it kind of is following this predetermined score that we've created for it. So the last part that I wanted to talk about is this concept of taking play and joint play and how it connects to Sarika's project with her toy. So this is kind of where the randomness is really fun because, you know, as a human, you're playing with the toy and you're not sure what's really going to happen, obviously. You haven't looked at the code, you don't know, it's kind of a black box to you. So you're playing with it and you're messing with the toy and, you know, something might happen. Maybe it'll grow in intensity. Maybe you're not being intense enough and that'll tell you that you have to, you know, be really rough with it to make it move to the next section. In the same way the computer doesn't know what's going to happen because of this randomness that we've added into it. So it knows that action 1, on average, has a positive score, but, you know, that doesn't mean that it actually will, which means you get this interesting, like, evolving piece of music where every time you play it, the computer is going to come up with new things and come up with new ways to communicate with you as, you know, a collaborative musician would. Okay, and then we have a short video demo to kind of show how it works. Just for reference, the period threshold here is 5. So if our intensity with the toy is over 5, it'll increment that count. And if the count threshold reaches 3, that's when it moves to the next section of the piece. And this is super short, just to show kind of how it works. And I know there's feedback, so I'm going to try to be quiet when I do this. Should I press play? Make it see the background. Cool. So you can see that when I hit that count of 3, it moves to that kind of higher intense version, and I just put in that initial beat, and it generated the high intensity one, and when it noticed that its count had gone high enough, and when the intensity was high enough for a long enough period of time, it switched to this next section. And you can see I really had to be rough with it, which I think kind of fed into this idea of really engaging with the plastic and really like facing this thing that's kind of scary. You really have to get in the weeds there to make any sound. And yeah, that's our project. Thank you for listening. Oh, sorry.